There's a moment that comes for many people, not when the relationship ends, but long after. When the noise dies down, when the distractions fade, when you're finally left alone with your own patterns. And in that silence, you realize something unsettling. You didn't just lose someone, you lost someone who saw you clearly and stayed anyway. That kind of love is rare, because an empath doesn't love you for your highlight reel. They love you in your contradictions. They love you when you're guarded, when you're confused, when you're still figuring yourself out. But here's the truth. Most people don't want to face. That kind of love is also confronting. Because when someone sees you that deeply, you don't get to hide behind charm, distance, or excuses anymore. You don't get to play the version of yourself that keeps you safe from real vulnerability. And for many, that's overwhelming. So what do? They pull away. They create distance. They tell themselves, this isn't right. When what they really mean is, this feels too real. You see, it wasn't that the love was too much. It was that it required more of you than you were willing to give at the time. More honesty, more presence, more emotional responsibility. And instead of rising to meet that love, you retreated to what felt familiar. Because chaos is familiar. Inconsistency is familiar. Being unsure where you stand, that's familiar. But healthy love, steady love, love that shows up every day and says, I'm here, I see you, and I'm not running. That requires a different version of you. And maybe at that time, you weren't ready to become that person. But here's where this becomes powerful, because this isn't about regret. It's about awakening. The empath you lost wasn't just someone who loved you. They were an invitation to grow, an invitation to heal, an invitation to become someone capable of receiving the very thing you say you want. And if you miss that opportunity once, it doesn't mean you're doomed. But it does mean you have to ask yourself a hard question. Am I still the person who couldn't handle that love? Or am I willing now to do the work it takes to be ready? When that kind of love shows up again? Because next time, it might not come with the same patience. Next time, it might not wait as long. Next time, you might not get a second chance. So this is where you decide, not in words, not in promises, but in actions. You decide to stop running from depth. You decide to stop confusing intensity with connection. You decide to stop pushing away the very thing that could change your life. Because the greatest tragedy isn't losing someone who loved you deeply. The greatest tragedy is staying the same person who couldn't recognize it when you had it. And the greatest victory, becoming someone who never lets that kind of love slip through their hands again. You didn't lose someone ordinary. You lost someone who chose you deeply, even when it wasn't easy. And that distinction matters more than people realize. Because many people enter relationships when it feels good, when it's exciting, when everything is effortless and light. But very few people stay when things become complicated, when misunderstandings happen, when life exposes the imperfect parts of who we are. An empath doesn't just love the easy moments. They choose you in the difficult ones too. They notice the small shifts in your mood before you say a word. They sense the heaviness you carry even when you pretend everything is fine. They read between the lines of your silence, your distance, your hesitation, and instead of walking away the moment things feel uncertain, they lean in and try to understand. That kind of presence is rare, because choosing someone deeply means seeing the layers most people hide. It means recognizing the flaws, the fears, the contradictions, and still deciding that the person in front of you is worth patience. But here's the paradox of that kind of love. When someone chooses you that deeply, it can feel both comforting and confronting at the same time. Comforting, because there's a sense that you don't have to perform anymore. You don't have to constantly prove yourself or compete for their attention. You feel accepted in a way that feels grounding, but confronting because their presence exposes the parts of you that haven't grown yet. An empath doesn't just celebrate your strengths. They quietly hold space for your wounds. And when someone does that, it removes the masks we often wear in relationships. Suddenly, you're seen. Not the polished version of you, not the charming version you present to the world, but the real you, the one who struggles with vulnerability, the one who sometimes shuts down instead of opening up, the one who doesn't always know how to receive love that is steady and sincere. And for some people, being seen like that can feel overwhelming, because it requires a level of honesty with yourself that you may not be ready for. So instead of leaning into that depth, many people unconsciously resist it. They question it. They distance themselves from it. Not because the love is wrong, but because it asks them to step into emotional territory they've never fully explored. The empath, however, keeps choosing. They choose to stay patient when communication gets messy. They choose to believe in your potential when you doubt yourself. They choose to show up with warmth, even after moments of misunderstanding. And what most people don't realize is that this kind of love isn't passive, it's intentional. An empath doesn't stay because they're naive. They stay because they see the humanity in you. They see the parts of you that are still growing, still learning, still figuring out how to love and be loved. They believe that connection is worth the effort. But when that kind of love is pushed away or taken for granted, the loss is deeper than people initially understand. Because what you lost wasn't just a partner. You lost someone who looked at your imperfect, evolving self and said, "I'm willing to walk beside you while you figure it out." That level of emotional investment is not common. Most people leave at the first sign of difficulty. Most people choose convenience over depth. Most people protect themselves by keeping relationships at the surface level, where vulnerability never truly has to exist. But an empath steps beyond that surface. They offer something that asks for mutual courage. And when someone walks away from that kind of love, it's often not because the empath was too much. It's because their depth revealed how much emotional growth was still needed to truly meet them there. An empath's love isn't something you can sustain on charm, attraction, or good intentions alone. It asks for something deeper: emotional maturity. Because at the beginning, almost anyone can show up. Anyone can send the right messages, say the right words, create moments that feel intense and meaningful. But an empath isn't just responding to what you say or do in the moment. They are attuned to who you are over time. And that's where the difference shows. Emotional maturity means consistency. It means your words and actions align, not just when it's convenient, but especially when it's difficult. It means you don't disappear when things feel overwhelming or uncertain. It means you don't leave the other person guessing about where they stand. An empath feels everything more deeply, including inconsistency. They notice when your energy shifts. They notice when your energy shifts. They notice when your effort drops. They notice when your presence becomes unpredictable. And while they may try to understand it at first, over time it creates a quiet instability in the connection, because their love is steady. And steady love needs something steady in return. Emotionally delayed, emotional maturity also means accountability. It means being able to look at your own behavior without immediately becoming defensive. It means recognizing when you've hurt someone, not just explaining it away, not just justifying it, but actually taking responsibility for it. An empath doesn't expect perfection. They're often the most forgiving people you'll meet. But they do need honesty. They need to know that when something breaks between you, you're willing to repair it, not avoid it, not ignore it, not sweep it under the rug and hope time will fix it. Without that accountability, the relationship starts to feel one-sided. The empath becomes the one constantly holding space, constantly understanding, constantly adjusting. And over time, even the most patient heart begins to feel exhausted. Emotional maturity also requires presence. Not just physical presence, not just physical exhausted. Being there not only when things are light and easy, but when conversations become uncomfortable. When vulnerability is required. When the relationship asks you to open up in ways that feel unfamiliar. An empath doesn't connect on the surface. They want depth. They want to know what you feel, what you fear, what you fear, what you fear, been through, what shapes the way you love. And that kind of connection cannot exist if one person is guarded while the other is open, because depth cannot be built alone. And here's the part many people misunderstand. It's C. Not that an empath expects too much. It's that they expect time's alignment. They're willing to give their energy, their care, their attention, but they're also quietly observing whether you're capable of meeting them in that same space. Not perfectly, not flawlessly, but genuinely. When emotional maturity is missing, the relationship becomes unbalanced. One person is doing the emotional work for two. One person is carrying the weight of connection, while the other stays comfortable at a distance. And that imbalance doesn't just weaken the relationship, it slowly erodes it. Because no matter how deeply an empath loves, they cannot build something meaningful with someone who isn't willing to grow. Their love is not meant to compensate for emotional unavailability. It's meant to meet someone who is ready to engage, to communicate, to evolve. And when that readiness isn't there, The connection starts to feel like a lesson instead of a partnership. Not because the love wasn't real, but because it required a level of emotional depth that one person hadn't yet developed. And in that gap between love offered and love sustained, the relationship begins to slip. Not from a lack of feeling, but from a lack of capacity to hold something that was real, steady, and asking to be met with the same level of awareness. You pushed away consistency because it exposed your inconsistency. At first, it didn't feel like that. It felt like something was missing. Like the spark wasn't strong enough. Like the excitement wasn't intense enough. Like something just didn't quite pull you the way you expected it to. And so you told yourself a story that maybe this connection wasn't right. Maybe this person wasn't it. Maybe you needed something that felt more alive. But what you were really feeling wasn't a lack of connection. It was the unfamiliarity of stability. Because when someone shows up for you in a consistent way, when their words match their actions, when their energy doesn't fluctuate depending on mood or convenience, when they don't leave you guessing, it creates a kind of clarity that can be uncomfortable if you're used to chaos. Consistency removes the guessing game. And for someone who has learned to associate love with uncertainty, that guessing game can feel like chemistry. The highs and lows, the unpredictability, the moments of closeness followed by distance. That pattern can feel intense, even addictive. It keeps you engaged, always trying to figure out where you stand, always trying to earn the next moment of connection. But consistency doesn't work like that. Consistency is calm. It's steady. It doesn't spike your emotions in dramatic ways. It doesn't create anxiety that you then confuse for passion. It simply shows up again and again without needing to prove itself through extremes. And when you're not used to that, it can feel flat. Not because it lacks depth, but because it lacks chaos. So when the empath showed up consistently, when they communicated clearly, when they made time for you, when they expressed care without hesitation, it didn't activate the same emotional roller coaster you were familiar with. Instead, it held up a mirror. A mirror that quietly asked, "Can you meet this? Can you be as clear as they are? Can you be as present as they are? Can you be as present as they are? Can you be as intentional as they are? Can you be as intentional as they are?" And if the answer, deep down, was no, that mirror became uncomfortable. Because their consistency highlighted your inconsistency. It revealed the moments you pulled away instead of leaning in. The times you avoided difficult conversations, the ways your effort fluctuated depending on how you felt in the moment. It made those patterns visible, not through criticism, but through contrast. And sometimes contrast is more confronting than confrontation, because they didn't need to call you out. Their steadiness already showed the difference. So instead of stepping up to match that consistency, it felt easier to step back from it, to create space, to question the connection, to convince yourself that something wasn't right. But what wasn't right wasn't the love being offered. It was the gap between what was being given and what you were ready to return. Consistency requires discipline. It requires you to show up even when you're unsure, even when you're tired, even when your instinct is to withdraw. It asks you to move beyond reacting to your emotions and instead act with intention. And if you haven't built that within yourself yet, being around someone who has can feel like pressure, not because they demand it, but because their presence naturally raises the standard. And that's the moment where people make a choice, to grow into that standard or to retreat to what feels familiar. Familiar might mean inconsistency. It might mean connections where effort is uneven, where communication is unclear, where emotional responsibility is minimal. Because in those dynamics, your own inconsistency doesn't stand out. It blends in. But with someone consistent, there's nowhere to hide. You're either meeting them or you're not. And when you're not ready to meet them, it can feel easier to walk away than to confront the parts of yourself that need to change. So you tell yourself it wasn't enough. You tell yourself it didn't feel right. You tell yourself you need something different. But in reality, you stepped away from something steady because it required a steadiness you hadn't yet developed. And that's the quiet truth behind why consistency often gets pushed away. Not because it lacks value, but because it reveals with uncomfortable clarity the work that still needs to be done with I. Their presence challenged your patterns, not your worth. And that's a distinction that's easy to miss when you're in the middle of it. Because when someone comes into your life and starts seeing you clearly, really seeing you, it can feel personal. It can feel like you being judged. like you're being measured, like somehow you're not enough as you are. But that's not what's happening. An empath doesn't enter your life to diminish your worth. They're not there to point out your flaws to make you feel smaller. In fact, they often see your value more clearly than you see it yourself. What they challenge are the patterns that keep you from living in alignment with that value, the habits, the defenses, the emotional reflexes you've built over time to protect yourself. Maybe it's the tendency to withdraw when things get too real. Maybe it's avoiding difficult conversations because they make you uncomfortable. Maybe it's keeping one foot out the door so you never have to fully commit and risk getting hurt. These patterns don't come from nowhere. They're usually shaped by past experiences, moments where vulnerability led to disappointment, where trust was broken, where opening up didn't feel safe. So you adapted. You learned how to protect yourself. And over time, those protective behaviors became automatic. They became part of how you show up in relationships without even thinking about it. Then someone like an empath enters your life. And instead of playing along with those patterns, they respond differently. They don't chase you when you withdraw, but they notice it. They don't explode when you avoid, but they feel the distance. They don't demand, but their presence quietly invites something deeper. And that's where the discomfort begins. Because suddenly your usual ways of navigating relationships don't create the same results. The space you create pull them closer. It creates a gap. The silence you rely on doesn't solve things. It leaves something unresolved. And instead of recognizing that your patterns are being challenged, it can feel like you are being challenged. It can feel like you're being asked to be someone else. Like you are emotionally delayed. Like you being pressured to change who you are. But the truth is, you're not being asked to become someone different. You're being asked to let go of what no longer serves you. There's a difference. Your worth has never been in question. Your value isn't something that needs to be proven or earned. An empath sees that from the beginning. That's part of why they connect with you so deeply. What they can't ignore, however, are the behaviors that create distance, confusion, or instability in the connection. And when those behaviors surface, their presence naturally brings awareness to them. Not through force, but through contrast. They communicate openly, which highlights your avoidance. They stay consistent, which highlights your inconsistency. They lean into vulnerability, which highlights your tendency to guard yourself. And again, this isn't about judgment, it's about reflection. But reflection can be uncomfortable when you're not ready to look. So instead of seeing it as an opportunity to grow, it's easy to internalize it as criticism. To feel like you're being misunderstood. To believe that the relationship is asking too much from you. And that's often the moment when people pull away. Not because they're unworthy of love, but because they are not yet ready to face the patterns that love is revealing. Because real connection doesn't just validate you, it evolves you. And evolution requires awareness. It requires honesty. It requires a willingness to sit with parts of yourself that you might have avoided for a long time. An empath doesn't force that process, but that ear presence naturally initiates it. They create a space where depth is possible, where authenticity is welcomed, where emotional walls are gently challenged, not torn down, but questioned. And if you're not prepared for that kind of depth, it can feel easier to step away than to step forward. But stepping away doesn't mean the challenge disappears. It just means the patterns remain unexamined. Because the truth is, their presence wasn't highlighting your lack of worth. It was illuminating the gap between who you are and who you could become if you allowed yourself to grow beyond the patterns that once protected you but now hold you back. You mistook safe love for boring love and chaos for chemistry. And that confusion is more common than people realize. Because what we feel isn't always a reflection of what's good for us. Often it's a reflection of what's familiar. If you've spent enough time around inconsistency, where attention comes and goes, where affection is unpredictable, where you're never quite sure where you stand, your nervous system starts to recognize that instability is normal. Not healthy, not fulfilling, but normal. So when you encounter something different, something steady, something calm, something that doesn't leave you questioning everything, it can feel unfamiliar in a way that's hard to trust. Safe love doesn't spike your anxiety. It doesn't leave you checking your phone, wondering if they'll respond. It doesn't make you overanalyze every interaction, searching for hidden meaning. It simply shows up. And for someone who is used to emotional highs and lows, that kind of steadiness can feel quiet, too quiet. You might even start to wonder, where's the passion? Why doesn't this feel as intense? Why am I not thinking about them all the time in that obsessive way? But what you're actually noticing is the absence of chaos. Bikao. Say chaos creates intensity, it creates urgency, it creates longing, it creates that feeling of needing to figure things out, to win someone over, to hold on to something that feels uncertain. And that intensity can easily be mistaken for chemistry. It feels powerful. It feels consuming. It feels like something you can't ignore. But intensity is not the same as connection. Intensity often comes from unpredictability, from not knowing if someone will stay or leave, from feeling close one moment and distant the next, from experiencing emotional highs that are only possible because of the lows that come before them. It's a cycle, and cycles can feel addictive, because every time the connection returns after distance, it feels like relief. It feels like validation. It feels like something you've been craving finally being given to you again. That emotional roller coaster can trick you into believing you've found something deeply meaningful. But what you've actually found is something deeply stimulating. Safe love, on the other hand, doesn't operate in cycles. It doesn't withdraw just to come back stronger. It doesn't create distance just to make closeness feel more intense. It doesn't rely on emotional swings to keep your attention. It builds slowly. It builds through consistency, through trust, through repeated moments of reliability. It grows in a way that isn't always dramatic, but is deeply grounding. And if you've never learned to associate that kind of calm with love, it can feel underwhelming at first. Not because it lacks depth, but because it lacks the chaos you've been conditioned to respond to. So you start to question it. You tell yourself there's no spark. You tell yourself something is missing. You tell yourself it doesn't feel the way love is supposed to feel. And in doing so, you turn away from something stable and move back toward something familiar, something that keeps you guessing, something that keeps you emotionally activated, something that feels exciting in the moment, but often leaves you drained over time. And the empath, the one offering safe, steady love, gets labeled as not enough. Not because they aren't enough, but because their love doesn't trigger the same emotional patterns you've mistaken for connection. Their love doesn't make you anxious. It doesn't make you chase. It doesn't make you chase. It doesn't make you question your worth. It simply invites you to relax into something real. But relaxing can feel uncomfortable when you're used to being on edge. Because being on edge feels like engagement. It feels like passion. It feels like passion. It feels like something is happening. Stillness, by comparison, can feel unfamiliar. And so you misinterpret it. You walk away from something that could have grounded you, supported you, and grown with you, because it didn't feel as intense as what you were used to. Not realizing that what you were used to wasn't necessarily love, it was chaos wearing the mask of chemistry. They gave you a mirror, and instead of growing, you turned away. Not an obvious mirror, not one that loudly pointed out your flaws or demanded change, but a quiet, steady reflection, the kind that shows you who you are through contrast, through presence, through the way someone else chooses to show up with you. An empath has that effect. They don't need to criticize you for you to start seeing yourself more clearly. They don't need to dissect your behavior or call out your patterns in harsh ways. Their way of loving, open, attentive, emotionally aware, naturally creates a space where things become visible. You start to notice the differences. The way they communicate honestly while you hold things in. The way they stay present in difficult moments while you look for an exit. The way they express care consistently while your effort fluctuates depending on your mood or certainty. And again, this isn't about them being better than you. It's about them being in a different place emotionally. But when you're standing in front of that kind of reflection, it can feel confronting because it gently exposes the gap between who you are right now and who you could be if you allowed yourself to grow. And growth isn't comfortable. Growth asks you to pause and take responsibility. It asks you to question your habits. It asks you to look at the ways you might be contributing to the very problems you say you don't want. That kind of self-awareness requires humility. It requires you to admit that maybe your way of handling things hasn't been working, that maybe the distance you create, the avoidance you rely on, the inconsistency you justify, maybe those patterns are part of why your connections don't last the way you want them to. And for many people, that realization feels heavy. Not because they're incapable of change, but because change means letting go of what feels familiar. It means stepping into a version of yourself that is more present, more accountable, more emotionally available. And if you've never practiced that before, it can feel overwhelming. So instead of leaning into the mirror, instead of allowing it to guide your growth, it feels easier to turn away from it, to create distance from the person who reflects those things back to you. Because when you step away, the reflection fades. You no longer have to face those contrasts every day. You no longer feel that quiet pressure to rise to a higher level of emotional awareness. You can return to what feels comfortable, to the patterns you understand, to the behaviors that don't ask too much of you, to connections where your habits don't stand out as clearly. But here's the truth about turning away from a mirror like that. You don't stop being who you are. You only stop seeing it as clearly. The patterns remain. The tendencies remain. The same emotional habits follow you into the next connection, and the next, and the next. Because growth doesn't happen through avoidance. It happens through awareness. The empath didn't create your patterns. They revealed them, and that revelation wasn't meant to shame you. It was meant to give you a choice to evolve, a choice to take responsibility for the parts of yourself that hold you back from deeper, more meaningful connection. But growth requires courage. It requires you to sit with discomfort instead of escaping it, to stay in conversations that challenge you, to be honest in moments where it would be easier to withdraw. And if you're not ready for that, turning away can feel like relief. Relief from the pressure, relief from the introspection, relief from the silent invitation to become more than you've been. But that relief is temporary, because eventually in quieter moments, that same awareness returns, not as a mirror in front of you, but as a realization within you that what you walked away from wasn't just a person. It was an opportunity to see yourself clearly and grow beyond the patterns that have been quietly shaping your relationships all along. The loss isn't just of a person, it's of the version of you that could have evolved with them. And that's the part that doesn't hit immediately. At first, it feels like you've simply moved on from someone who wasn't quite right. You focus on the differences, the doubts you had, the reasons you told yourself it wouldn't work. You convince yourself that whatever you had was replaceable, that there will be other connections, other opportunities, other people. And on the surface, that's true. There will be other people. But not every connection carries the same potential for growth. Because every once in a while, you meet someone who doesn't just fit into your life as it is. They challenge you to expand beyond it. Someone who doesn't just meet you at your current level, but quietly invites you to rise. Not rough pressure, not through force, but through the way they love, the way they communicate, the way they hold themselves in the relationship. That kind of connection creates possibility. Possibility for you to become more patient than you've been before, more open than you've allowed yourself to be, more consistent, more present, more emotionally aware. It offers you a version of yourself that you haven't fully stepped into yet. And when you walk away from that, you're not just leaving behind the person, you're stepping away from that version of you as well. The version that would have learned how to stay instead of run. The version that would have learned how to communicate instead of avoid. The version that would have learned how to meet depth with depth rather than retreat into comfort. Growth in relationships doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in interaction, in the moments where you're challenged to respond differently, in the moments where you're invited to show up more fully, in the moments where love asks you to stretch beyond your privileged patterns and choose something better. An empath creates those moments, not because they demand change, but because their presence naturally calls it forward. They create an environment where evolution is possible. But possibility is not the same as inevitability. You still have to choose it. And if you don't, if you resist it, avoid it, or walk away from it, that potential doesn't disappear into nothing. It simply remains unrealized. That's the deeper loss. Because time moves on. Life continues. You meet other people, have other experiences, build other connections. But that specific combination, the person you were at that moment, and the opportunity that relationship presented doesn't come back in the same way. It was unique, a crossroads, a moment where you could have stepped into something great, within yourself. And when that moment passes, it often takes time before you fully understand what it meant. Because growth is subtle when it's happening, but obvious in hindsight. You begin to notice the patterns that repeat, The same misunderstandings, the same distances, the same endings that feel strangely familiar. And at some point, a realization starts to form that what you lost wasn't just someone who cared about you. It was someone who created the conditions for you to become more than you were. And without that influence, without that reflection, without that steady presence encouraging something higher in you, it's easier to stay where you are. Not because you can't grow on your own, but because you're no longer being actively invited to. That's why certain connections leave a lasting imprint. Not because of how intense they were, but because of who you were becoming within them. And when you lose that, you're left with a choice. To continue as you are, or to consciously step into that growth on your own. Because while the person may be gone, the awareness they brought into your life doesn't have to be. That version of you, the one who could love better, show up stronger, connect deeper, it still exists as a possibility. But now it's no longer something the relationship will draw out of you. It's something you have to choose, deliberately without the presence that once made that evolution feel natural and within reach. Thank you for your time and trust. Wishing you clarity, growth, and endless strength on your journey. Goodbye for now. May every step forward bring you closer to the love and life you deserve.